Hi, my name is Richard Coots. This is an abbreviated version of a talk I gave at two separate International Association for the Study of Dream conferences, and then I also gave to a select group of researchers at Harvard's Center for Sleep and Cognition at Beth Deaconess Medical Center here in Boston. The talk is an introduction to my theory of dreaming called emotional selection, which I published in my 2008 paper titled Dreams as Modifiers and Tests of Mental Schemas and Emotional Selection Hypothesis. There's a lot of technical information in the paper that I will not address in this talk. If you have questions, please refer to the paper or feel free to post a comment below, and I'd be happy to respond to it. To start the talk, I'd like to begin speaking anecdotally with the experience of a dream. For starters, we're almost always in our dreams, and furthermore, other people tend to be in our dreams as well. And we interact with the people in our dreams, and sometimes the interaction is pleasant. Other times, characters are introduced where the interaction is not so pleasant. Regardless, there's some scenario, commonly referred to as a dream scenario, that unfolds. And if we're lucky, the dream seems to resolve itself. And this is often referred to as mastering a dream. And so a lot of people have made this observation, and some researchers have used it to support their idea that dreams serve a function. And many theories have come about to describe what potential function dreams may be serving. And while the problem is that while some dreams seem to resolve themselves, or that we tend to master the dream, there's a lot of dreams that we have that we don't master, and rather than mastering the dream seems to master us. So other theorists have kind of jumped on this observation and said that dreams do not serve a function, and there's theories abound that describe how dreams are really just byproduct of other processes that occur during sleep. So where does my theory, emotional selection, fall into this? My theory says that dreams serve a very important function, and as I will be discussing, the nice thing about my theory is that it describes not only the clearly functional dreams, but also those ones that don't appear to serve a function fit neatly into my theory as well. So the cocktail party description of my theory says that dreams modify understanding. And it's a overly simplistic definition, and it's not a particularly unique definition. There are a lot of the previous theories that say that dreams modify understanding. What is unique or novel about my theory is that my theory says that dreams actually do not one but two things. The first is that they modify understanding. The second thing that they do is that they test the understanding that was previously modified. So again, this is a simplistic definition. Now I'm going to give my more jargony definition of emotional selection, which is that dreams modify and test mental schemas. And I'll be discussing mental schemas in the next slide. As I said, dreams, the theory says that there are two types of dreams. The type that modify, which happen during non-REM sleep, and then the type of dreams that test prior modifications, which happen during REM sleep. So a mental schema is really quite a simple concept. It's a mental structure that holds a concept. And the idea has been around for a couple hundred years. And the nice thing about mental schema is that it's really a cross-disciplinary definition, that it fits neatly into not only psychology and psychiatry, but also neurology and other sciences that deal with the brain. So all these folks like mental schemas, so it's easy to kind of talk about them with all the groups. So if you could map your mental schemas in your brain or in your mind, it looks something like this. It would be this big tangle of a network, and each node of the network is a concept. So you might have the concept of a ball, and you might have the concept of bounce and roll, and these schemas network together to form a more comprehensive understanding. And but not only do they model concrete ideas, but they also model less tangible ideas. And so if you could zoom in on a couple schemas, we'll find that schemas would also model our independence, ambitiousness, dependence, things like that. And one of the interesting things about schemas is not only that they can network together and agree with each other, but they can also directly conflict. For example, we have schemas that model our dependency that would conflict with schemas that model our independency, or our sense of being independent. And it may sound like dependency is a bad thing and independence is a good thing, but not if you're a small child. If children benefit from a sense of being dependent, and as you mature into adulthood, you gain a sense of independence. And even as an adult, you also we're also dependent on the people around us for safety and lots of things. So these schemas tend to conflict, and so the mind is constantly trying to strike the balance as to which to rely on and which to evolve. So that's our tangle of networks of schemas, which are complex. It's a huge network that abstracts physical and social worlds, and these are all interconnected. Schemas, as psychologists have known for decades, tend to be distorted. We all have a distorted idea of how popular, skillful, and competent we are. If we actually knew how unskilled and unpopular we really were, or we perceived this, we'd actually be depressed. So a healthy mind has a distorted sense of who it is, and this is adds to the complexity of schemas. And as I discussed, there are internal conflicts as well. So not only is this network extremely complicated, it also amazingly evolves throughout our lifetime. A simulation is the process of when schemas can adequately describe what's going on around them. But when they can't describe it, they have the ability to morph and self-modify in order to learn. And that process is referred to as accommodation. And examples of this, as we discussed, is when children mature and our environments changes and we experience new things, our schemas must morph to adapt to the environment. So we know schemas are complex and they evolve. So what can we say about all things that are complex that evolve? And I think we can safely say that without exception, that what drives evolution is what's commonly referred to as a design cycle, a cycle where a phase of modification is followed by a phase of testing. That's what Darwin just discovered in his theory of natural selection, that every generation varies in some important manner and then goes out into nature where it is tested. And those attributes that are beneficial are selected by nature, while those are not are culled. Engineers also use a design cycle referred to as iterative design when they design the complex systems that we use every day. And they have a phase of design followed by testing and analyzing. And so what I'm saying here today is while we're sleeping, there's a design cycle that occurs of accommodation in which our mind modifies itself through non-REM dreams during which the schemas accommodate new information. But is that accommodation beneficial? For example, if we develop a new sense of independence, is that beneficial, or are we better off feeling dependent? So what the mind does is it enters REM sleep, where a REM dream test occurs, and if the schemas perform well during the test, then the emotions select the schemas. If we're relaxed, if we emotionally process the dream well. If we are overly frightened during a dream, then the schemas may reject the changes and restore the previous changes. There's a lot of parallels between these design cycles that I argue are not coincidental. The tests that occur during natural selection tend to be very extreme, quite literally life or death. The tests that engineers employ every day can also be extreme. And not only that, they can also be quite bizarre. How strange would it be if you looked out your window and saw your neighbors all intentionally crashing their automobiles together? You would certainly describe their behavior as bizarre. But when engineers do the exact same thing, the test seems very rational. And likewise, when we review the dreams that we have, they may seem quite bizarre, but when we start to look at them as tests, they actually can seem quite rational. For example, this dream this woman is having, when viewed as a test of her ability to cope with fear, actually could be a really good test of her ability to cope with fear, a quite rational test. Going back to natural selection, while some tests are quite extreme, others are quite mundane. If the shape of an animal's esophagus isn't quite right, it may not survive. If it's the color of its plumage isn't the right shade of red, it may not be selected for mating. Some of the tests are extreme, some are quite mundane. Engineers, a lot of the tests they do are likewise extremely mundane, quite tedious tests. And as researchers have known, a lot of the dreams that are logged within a laboratory are quite mundane. Now, if you were to take this iterative design process that engineers use and plot it over time, you would get a curve that looks something like this. And it would start when the system is online, and during the first phase of design, it would be taking offline. And that's what I'm showing on the y-axis here, is the degree of it being taken offline. And in the first phase of design, it's taking way offline. This is when the system is really taken apart and its most extreme modifications are made. So if this was a physical system, it might be taken apart, strewn across a lab table, things like that. If it was a software system, software engineers refer to a system as being gutted because it's really being taken down at its core. And then after the first phase of design, it goes into testing. And in the first test, you really effectively have a prototype. You don't have a functioning system, and you just lightly test it here. So the first phase of testing tends to be quite short. After you take your results from the first phase of testing, you go back to design, and here you're again making major modifications, but you're not quite as major as the first design phase typically. Then you do more testing, and here you have more of a complete system, so you do a little bit test for a little bit longer, more modifications, more testing, and then when you get to the last phase, you're really only tweaking at the last phase. You're about to bring the system back online, and you don't want to make any major modifications. If a manager, say, were to come to an engineer and say, I want to make some major modifications, it's the engineer's responsibility to say, you cannot do that. We're about to go live and it would be too risky. So right here, you only want to do tweaks. And then in the last phase of testing, you do your most major, most rigorous testing and for the longest period of time to ensure that it's safe, that it does what it needs to do. And then you release the system. This is what the sleep researchers see in the laboratory for the REM, non-REM cycles of the average person. And what I'm saying is that this maps nicely to what engineers see in their day-to-day design of thinking. So what I'm saying is that we're awake, and then in our first non-REM sleep, the brain and the mind go offline. They go way offline. And this is where the most intense modifications to the schemas take place. After the schemas are modified, REM sleep kicks in, and the schemas are really effectively a prototype at this point. So REM sleep tends to be short, and then all tests are done, and then the second phase of non-REM begins, where it's not quite as deep as the first phase, and the results of the prior REM sleep are implemented or taken into account while further modifications done. More REM tests, more non-REM accommodations to schemas, and just the way an engineer would proceed, the mind proceeds. And then in the last non-REM phase, prior to waking up, the mind and brain don't want to make major modifications to its schemas because it's about to go live. And then you have your last REM sleep, which is where the testing for the last schemas before they brought online occurs. And a lot of the characteristics of dreams kind of map nicely to this. The first REM sleep tend to be the most mundane dreams, and then towards the last REM sleep, just prior to waking, sleep researchers have observed that dreams tend to be the most bizarre and the most extreme in this case, which maps neatly to what an engineer would do, which is to rigorously test a system before it goes live, and then you wake up. So here's the mapping of the non-REM cycle to emotional selection. The non-REM phase is when the accommodation or the modifications to the schemas occurs, and then emotional selection occurs during the REM period. Here is the way, here's the same mapping that we just discussed, only mapped to the cycle. So when you first fall asleep, you experience what they call slow wave sleep, where it's theorized that your neural networks are somewhat primed for learning. And then you have your non-REM dreams, which is where the accommodation to schemas occurs. Then they have what you call P waves, which solidifies somewhat of what you've the modifications to schemas. And then you have your REM dreams, where the emotional selection or the testing of the schemas occurs, during which the amygdala, which is a part of the brain that's responsible for emotions, is highly active, and it selects which modifications or which accommodations to retain and which to ignore. And then onset dreams are the dreams you experience just prior to falling asleep, which is the type of dream that would solidify the new neural connections that occur as a result of the schema accommodations. And again, this is in my paper. If you want to check out my paper, it talks about this in more detail, but I don't want to go into much more of it here. One of the interesting things, I have an engineering background, and when I describe my theory to engineers, they really pretty much get it right away. And interestingly, I find it more difficult to explain it to psychologists and psychiatrists. And it's not that I necessarily think that they would buy into my theory, but it's just I'll talk to them about half an hour, and then it just occurs to me we're talking about two different things. And what I've kind of realized that the way an engineer talks about testing and the way a psychologist talks about testing is really quite different. So what I want to do here is talk about the way an engineer views a test, and then that can be applied to the way the brain and mind would use tests to test its schemas. So as an example, I want to talk about during the 80s, NASA was trying to improve the survivability of crash victims during an airliner. So what they realized is that when airline or airplanes crash, it's not the impact of the crash that typically injures or kills people. It's the fireball that occurs afterwards. And so they were looking for a way to diminish the fireball so that people could survive plane crashes. And so they came up with this fuel additive called FM9, which eliminated the misting that occurs in fireballs, and therefore, or they hoped to eliminate the misting, which would reduce the fireball. So they completed FM9, and so how would you test that? You've developed this fuel additive for airliners that tests their ability to survive, to not explode when an airplane crashes. So how would you test that? Well, as a former engineer myself, the only way I would know how to test it would be to get a very large airplane, fill it full of fuel, put the FM9 in the fuel tanks, and then crash the airplane. And that's really the only way to be certain that what you've done, it will actually work. So that's what NASA did. They took an airliner, they filled it full of crash test dummies, and then they crashed it in the desert, and hoping that it wouldn't explode, that it might break apart, but that it just would, the fuel would just pour out, and that would be the end of it. But this is what happened. It blew up into a fireball that took an hour to put out for firefighters. So it effectively, the FM9 didn't work. So as a result, it's not a fuel additive in airlines today. So what emotional selection says is that the mind really kind of has the same problem. It makes modifications and design changes to the way it interprets or perceives the world, but are those changes really adaptive? And so the only way it can be known for certain is to actually test it before it uses it live. So the schemas are modified while we sleep. And then how would you test these schemas? Well, you would have a dream that would recreate the situation in which the schemas were being modified to cope with. And if you process the dream well, which doesn't mean that you're not frightened, if you may be frightened during a dream of being in a fire, but if you can control your fear and act accordingly in a constructive way, then that's a sign that your schemas are working well and that those prior modifications would be adopted. But if you're paralyzed with fear during a dream, then there's a chance that your schemas are not performing well and that you'll have similar dreams in the future as your mind continually modifies those schemas. And that's true of really any dream theme you could think of. When you start thinking of them as tests, it's really quite easy to see the schemas that they would be testing. One of the interesting is, well, how would a pleasant dream be considered as a test? And the answer is that a lot of people have trouble with coping with happiness. People with alcoholism and substance abuse problems will often sabotage their happiness because they don't feel that they deserve to have good things happen to them. So if you have a pleasant dream and you fully embrace the dream and enjoy it for what it is, then that's a sign that your schemas are well equipped to cope with happiness. There are many reports of flying dreams where people couldn't get off the ground, or when they became self-conscious, they fell to the ground, and that's an example of the schemas not being coping well with the happiness experience during the dream. Dreams tend to not be remembered, and we dream at least 2 hours a night, and yet we typically don't remember the contents of most or all of our dreams, and that's really quite a simple explanation. When you buy an automobile, there were maybe 40,000 tests that occurred in the making of that automobile, but you don't need to know what those tests are. You just need to know that that automobile is safe and does what it was intended to do. And likewise, we don't need to know what our dreams are. They're tests that are modifying our mind, and it doesn't really we don't need to know what they are. And so on those occasions we actually remember them, they're more happy accidents than anything intentional. Repeat dreams are quite often experienced where people have similar dream themes over and over again, or even sometimes the identical dream theme over and over again. And that's really just an example of the mind continually working on the same set of schemas, and sometimes these modifications can take months or years to develop. And if improvement is happening, what you will find is that you're more and more able to cope with the scenario of the dream. That when you were a child and you had a certain dream, or a young adult, then you might have been terrified during a certain dream, but later in your life you find that when you have the same dream, you actually process it a lot easier. And that's an example of how your schemas are improving. And eventually, once your mind is satisfied that those schemas are satisfactory, those dream themes will stop and you'll move on to another concern. So in conclusion, Darwin described quite nicely a cyclical process that occurred during the evolution of humans in their brains and minds. His cycle describes variation as natural selection. And what I'm saying is his cycle takes us up until when we're born, and then the cycle of accommodation followed by emotional selection picks up there, and throughout a lifetime our mind continues to evolve. So our mind has evolved over millions of years, and then after we're born it continues to evolve, and obviously not on a genetic level, but certainly on a neurological level, as new connections are forming, as schemas evolve. So that's my in a nutshell, my theory of emotional selection. I hope you enjoyed this talk. If you have more questions, again, please feel free to check out the paper or write a comment below, and I'll be happy to respond to it. And thanks again.